Well, good day. It's 9 o'clock here in London, and it's late afternoon in Shenzhen. And we are absolutely delighted today to be welcoming Professor Fan Kong. Professor Fan, great to see you.
Good to see you. Nice to see you.
We're going to have an interesting discussion today about the importance of a post-COVID economic recovery and what it means around the world. Professor Fan's biography is on our website, as you know, but he heads up the China Development Institute, with which Xian does a lot of work over a number of years, very important, possibly one of our most important partners. So it is a real honor to have his insights here today. The approach that we're going to take today is a light discussion between Professor Fan and I. It was sort of a structured interview. We've agreed an outline of it. But I might point out to you that there is an opportunity to ask questions, and all you need to do is to just tap on the GoToWebinar facility for asking a question. It will come to me, and as you're aware, many questions are often duplicates or what have you, but I will try and field as many as we can just after 10:30 at 10:30 our time, so 30 minutes into this at the moment. There are nearly 100 people on the line, so I will do my best to get through the bulk of the questions that you send. Now, just one little slide about how we see things before we move on to some of the talking points. I think it is just important to remind ourselves for 15 seconds about how much China has changed, but how much China has changed the world. When we began running our Global Financial Centers Index in 2005, I can assure you that for a number of years, probably until about 2012 or so, people laughed at us for including the Chinese centers that we did. But as you look at this slide, you can see there's been a very consistent, almost one might say remorseless rise in the Chinese centers, whilst the leading centers of New York and London have been strong but stable. And it is a world under change, and it's a world that will continue to change. And that's why we're welcoming Professor Fan today. So, Professor Fan, just before we start, could you give me an idea? What's the top of your in tray? What's keeping you busy?
Now?
Yes.
What keeping us busy? Well, actually, quite busy on the internet. Quite busy with all this kind of the webinar conferences. And actually, it seems we have more meetings than offline, online meetings. But anyway, the topic here is, of course, the pandemic and the economy. As economists, you have to face the question about how the economy run. So that's a big theme. I think it's a topic everywhere, right? I think our topic, this online meeting is important. It's the right topic, economy and the pandemic. Truly. Yeah.
Now, you have a unique perspective. I mean, I assume mid-December, you had no idea that this was coming like the rest of us. But could you just give us a short recap on how you see things from mid-December to mid-May?
Yeah. Well, China, I would argue there's something like a 20-day confusion time. Well, the uncertainty, nobody knows what it is. Something happened, something wrong. The people start to report to the the health organization, report to the government official channels. But you need time to study. You need time to understand what's really going on. So there's a uncertainty time. Then, and people really confirmed that this is going to have a community infection. So then things start to turn, clear that you have to take actions. So on the day of January 23rd, government announced the lockdown Wuhan, but still not, of course, not yet locked down the country. I came back from Davos to Beijing on the Chinese New Year day. That's January 25th. When I took off the airplane, I saw everybody in Beijing with the face mask. At that time, I think I was confident. When I saw everybody with the face mask, I know this is going to be contained, because this is the most effective way to stop the spreading of the diseases. Anyway, so then more lockdown, and Beijing basically locked down everybody. You cannot move. That's all. So at the end of February, I would argue mostly it contained. Hubei still have a lot of cases, but other places mostly contained. Then in the middle of March, the problem, the end of the March, the problem is the second wave come. Second wave is imported cases, and Chinese nationals all want to come back because China now put the thing down, so it's already contained. So then we have a lot of the cases of this imported cases. Then you have imported, then you have community spreading. So that's basically the last month. I mean, the whole February, whole April is already was dealing with the imported. The domestic things are quite come down. Now, I would argue basically it's contained. In China, it's almost zero cases if we don't have a few cases of imported. So since I would say the 4 weeks ago, government started talking about the reopen the business, restart the industry. So now we are on the way, really reopening the service sector. There's a May 1st day holiday that we have a 5 days, holidays for that. A lot of places, local government issue, coupon for consumption, and museums, the parks, reopen. But of course, with the restrictions, with the 30% of capacity, something. Restaurant now is people can eat in restaurant, and a lot of people go to eat. So we see the recovery. Industry and constructions start to restart. I would say 6 weeks or 8 weeks ago. That's a part of Chinese economic activity. Which may not have the impact by this virus, because you have some distance in the industry and the construction. So it started, I would argue, now it's quite active, if not 100% capacity realized. I would argue 80% capacity. Well, the industry got a hit. Well, at the beginning, Chinese industry stopped, so that's get some blow to the international supply chain. Then in the March and the April, the other countries' supply chain, stopped. Then China get the problem, because we lost the supply. So anyway, that part, international supply chain is still not yet recovered. Although there are some industries now really restarted, particularly those for the domestic market. But for the international market, it is still, just beginning, I would say. Some countries start to work, reopen, and then the Chinese company start to get, supply from other parties. Anyway, so that's
wow. You and I, and in fact many of the people listening, are probably mostly office workers. When was the last physical meeting you had with colleagues or people outside your organization?
Well, I would say 2 to 3 times we have office meeting. Office meeting in the sense that it's not with my colleague. It's organized by the government. Discuss
okay.
that we present. Everybody, we sit in the big rooms. Everybody have the distance of 2 meters, something, and with a mask. Yeah, we have that meeting.
Okay.
But very few, very few. My office start to open middle March. Everybody we wear a face mask, but we have meetings, so we can really get together every day, all the time. That's no problem. In my institute have 150 people, and they are now working, and they are start to travel. They have the project. They now go to the places. So that's almost back to normal.
Okay.
As long as we with a mask.
With the face mask, yeah.
Mask is so important, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I was saying when we were having our pre-chat how thankful we were to the city of Xi'an for kindly sending 20,000 masks through to a care home that I happen to be a trustee of. So most appreciative of what's been going on back and forth. And in fact, I was involved in sending some equipment to China late January and early February. So it's been nice to see some international cooperation there.
Yeah.
Doug McWilliams asked a question. The West was slow to learn the lessons of the pandemic from China. What could we learn from you about the recovery from COVID, which is really the theme of this discussion. And so I was just wondering, Professor Fan, as a fellow economist, when you're looking at a situation like this, you try and find comparators or historical precedents. How are you analyzing this situation?
Well, I'm too young to experience too much. We didn't experience the war. We didn't experience the 1918 flu, the Spanish flu. But of course, we experienced the SARS. But this one, I would argue, is quite different from SARS. SARS, one thing is it's quite easy to contain because you cannot be infectious if you don't have the symptom, right? But the COVID-19, you spread the virus without any sign you are ill. So that's a terribly the problem. And secondly, it's quite a long time. This is a 14-day infection. That's all. Take a very, very long. So that's why reopening process could be very slow. So that's quite a different. At the time of SARS, it's quite short, and it's quite concentrated in a few places. But this one, you see, it's really hard to contain, and at the same time, it's widely spread. So that's really, quite a different. And also, I would argue that, the last time when we have the SARS, it just seems that the virus have something to do with the temperature, with the weather. But this one, it seems, all season active. So that's why we really need to prepare for long time fighting to this virus.
Now, here in the West, there have been many efforts to hold our economies together. Broadly, I think moving into direct worker support, furloughing, basically being, people being paid to whilst they stay at home, and direct loans to businesses, and then finally guarantees on loans to banks. What were the Chinese responses to the crisis in terms of from the government, in terms of holding things together? We'll get on to moving out in a minute, but what were some of the responses that your government made?
I think it's a similar measures. Well, maybe Chinese doing that in a different way. For example, Chinese government doesn't have, the unemployment payment like what happened in the U.S. Right?
Yep.
You pay directly to the unemployed workers.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese government just asked for the company, do not fire people, do not lay off people, and if you have the trouble, we give you some subsidy. So Chinese government gave the subsidies to mostly to the company rather than directly to the unemployed worker. And then also some loans, some holiday, debt holidays. You can delay your payment, you delay your interest payment, and you may get more, extra loans to your business, and also give you some subsidies for your social security, payment or something. So it's through company, not only the state company. Most of the problem now, unemployment problem, are in the non-state sector.
Right.
Those business in the service sector, small industries, those are suffered the most. So the government now helping those people, those small companies.
So very similar to what we're experiencing
Quite
here.
similar.
I see. And in terms of, we hope to learn from you, because you're whatever 6 weeks ahead of us or something. What do you feel we ought to be doing to prepare to come out? We've done what we can do to hold the situation together, but what economic measures would you recommend that a typical Western government ought to consider to help get the economy restarted? And I say that with a bit of humility, because an interesting example for me has always been, say, a country like Iraq, oil rich, invaded, and America has failed to find a way to restart that economy. And it's an economy sort of the size of California in terms of population and all that, yet just isn't moving. And they've had a long time to do it without a shortage of cash. So it's not just cash, is it? It's how you get people to move.
Yeah, I really don't know how the other people think about this, but for us, I think you have to make, if not 100% sure, but at least say 90% sure that you are safe. Make people feel safe in terms of virus. Without that, you open the economy, you have the problem with the people's health, and even you are facing the death toll. So that's not the way. That's not the way to reopen the economy. So for China, why people now willing to start to open the economy? Basically because they are really sure now it's safe. So as an economist, I would say this issue is not an economist issue. This is definitely the public health issue. How you can make a public feel safety, then you can go to the work. You can really go to reopen all the business. So I don't know how the other countries would deal with it. Yeah. That's that kind of the choice is not the economist's choice. This is because the people's life is not something you can count for money. You cannot. There's no value comparison with the people. So that's the lesson. One of the lessons I learned. I think this is first time for me to learn this. If we have the war, I think the same thing. if you cannot stop the war, people who are not fail safe, you go nowhere. You cannot really work, that way. So, that's I think it's better to make a big effort to get the pandemic under control. You make sure that we are going to be okay. We can walk, we can react, but we are not going to infect it. Of course, vaccine, the cure, that's so important now. From that point of view, I would say, before vaccine really available, economy could not be back to normal. Even China, I don't think of back to normal. China may be the first one to get back normal for the internal business, for the domestic economy, but with the external connections to the other part of the world, I don't think that will be over. So this is not the choice by the economists. This is the people's choice. This is the human being choice.
We have a question related to this from Bob McDowell. Bob McDowell is watching this from one of the Channel Islands in Alderney, and he asks, as a vast country, to what extent is China taking a regional approach to opening up after COVID-19?
Yeah, well, definitely China have 31 provinces. So there's 31 provinces as 31 region, and the different region have different degree of crisis. Have a different degree of the restriction. So that the regional government have some authority, but you still need to report to the central, and the central will evaluate your situation and compare your situation with the other situation, then give you the approval. So we have the regional activity, we have the regional policy and the regulation, but that's under very restrictive central control, central coordination. You have to, to report to the central, and the central compare your situation with others and check your connectivities to others, check your impact, your activities, your impact of your activities on others. So we have, this kind of the regionalism, but basically this is still the centralized,
still quite
centralized situation. Yeah.
Now, one of the interesting things about this crisis has been the pressure that it put onto a couple of global systems. I would pick out two. One is the supply chain. We had these highly efficient supply chains, but the efficiency meant that we were running through, for example, either very few nodes, or we were running on just in time. And nobody said, well, you really ought to keep 3 months stock no matter what. So there's been a pressure there, but there's equally been quite a bit of pressure on another system, the credit system. Again, nobody said that the economy ought to be able to take 3 months off and everybody ought to function properly. Do you have any thoughts about what that might do to China's trade relationships if people decide that they wish to have more flexibility, more redundancy, more resilience in the supply chain and the credit systems?
Yeah, well, this is a very good warning episode of the history to show people how the crisis like this can affect the economy and the supply chain. Nobody before, well, maybe everybody agreed that we need a globalization, but nobody really realized the globalization also means that this kind of the pandemic could be very global. and it could be no matter where it takes place, it will have a full reach, the influence on the others. So we expected this global supply chain will have some adjustment. For example, now people are talking about China plus one.
Yep.
If you all buy things from China, if China have this problem, you need some other supply, alternative supply. For the China too, we cannot have all the supply chain in US or in Europe. If US, Europe have the problem, then we have the problem. So we have to have, for example, US plus one or Europe plus one. We have to diversify some supply chain. So that's it's a natural. People realize if you concentrate. This is a problem, not the globalization, but actually it's a concentration and a diversification. So it's better to get some balance between the concentration and the diversification. You need a quality, but at the same time you need the quantity. You need a continuation of the supply chain. So that from that point of view, I would say this is a good morning call, and we need to construct this kind of the supply chain. Other system, as you said, this credit system, this financial system, but this is something we haven't experienced. Of course, a lot of people may experience it. For example, if we have a war, then you have a lot of things stopped, a lot of activities stopped. But this is definitely a very unique crisis. Everybody stopped. Then you have the whole system stopped. We need to find a way to deal with it.
Do you have a kind of a favorite plus one country or two that you think would benefit, or is that the wrong question? I mean, do you think this is something that's going to make Indonesia and Vietnam work, or India, or is that not the way to look at it?
Well, you mean for you or for China?
For both.
For Europe, China.
For us and for China.
Pardon?
For both.
Okay. I would argue that, for example, for Europe, you may need some kind of diversification nearby, not necessarily in Europe, but China plus somewhere in Africa, for example, or China somewhere like in Central Asia. But anyway, so for China, we may still want to have import a lot of things from Europe, but we may want to have diversify the import from Central Asia, for example. Also, Japan. Other Asian countries, nearby Asian countries. Okay. So I think anyway it goes.
Okay. We've got a lot of questions here and about 15 minutes, so I'm going to start getting into them, and we'll just try and keep our answers terse, if that's okay. Just following on from that last point, Doug McWilliams, who gave a talk last week on Belt Road, is asking, does Professor Fan have a view about the impact of the crisis on the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah. Well, I think that this pandemic shows we just talking about a diversification. Diversification means development in more other places, right? If we want to get the more supplies from other places, you need other places to develop it into the industries as well. So from that point of view, the One Belt One Road is just can help more country, more places to develop. That's one thing. Secondly, this pandemic really shows the world is so connected. Can we really go back to independent? Can we go back to cut off to our ties, our connections? I think that the only way is cooperate more widely and deeply. Cooperation on everything, not only on the production, the commerce, financial, but also cooperation on the public health, on the social dimensions. So I will argue that the One Belt One Road, you need to add more one dimension. Before it mostly concentrated very much on the construction, on the infrastructures, on the industries. But I think now people need to think about more about the public health, the social system, and I think people need that. And after this pandemic, I think people want to have a better global system for the public health.
Well, related to that, is a question from Dominique Guetry. Do you think the COVID crisis might have positive consequences in the U.S.-Chinese trade negotiations, which I understand are starting again next week?
Well, I'm not really quite sure, because it seems that the U.S., not all the people, but some politicians are going more extreme against China, want to decouple with China, and so that's why I would say, well, a lot of things are still happening, a lot of things are still developing, but basically, I do not see this pandemic will change some American politicians' basic strategy line, policy line, which is contain China's development. So I do not see any soften. I haven't seen any softened tone on the trade relationship and other relationships. Yeah.
Hugh Purser has two very interesting questions, to me at least. There have been two trends in China for a few decades now, and one has been towards urbanization, with people moving into the cities. Excuse me. And the second one has been, of course, the increase in the private sector. And as you alluded to earlier, the private sector has been taking the brunt of the economic hit here. Do you see either of those trends being delayed or reversed? So both urbanization and the growth of the private sector.
I think let's say the private sector thing first. I think the private sector get the further development because there's a pandemic. Well, this time, the online sales, the private business, private service sector really played a big role in the society. Now most of the active things are on the website. All those website companies are private. Alibaba, Tencent, and all this, and Jingdong. All these things. So that means the private sector is concentrated in small business. Private sector now is in the FinTech business, in the new business, in the new industries. So if China go further with the new industries, technologies, I think the private sector get more, room for the development. So from that point of view, I would say, and people are really give more attention to all the technologies, including the medicine, all those. And in this area, all the private sector, private companies are very active. So that's one thing. For the urbanization, well, urbanization is go on anyway. However, in the short run, of course, I would say maybe it's a slowdown because a lot of migrant workers now went back to the countryside and they stay. They are not well, at the beginning they're not allowed to go back to the city, but then the cities have no jobs. Now still cities have no order. They don't have the order from the globe, overseas market, so they don't have the jobs in the city. So I would argue maybe 50 million, migrant workers now still stay. They were, if no COVID-19, they would have out, in the city, but now they stay in the countryside. And also recently, Chinese government increased the subsidies to the rural, medical care and the social securities. So the situation in the rural areas are better. So they stay away. They may not come back to the city for a while or forever. So from that point of view, I would say this is delay or slow down the urbanization.
Very good. We've got a couple of questions. Jane Wormlate and Andrew Mitchell and a few others are just interested in maybe a little off topic for you, but what appetite is there in China to combat illegal wildlife trade into markets that might have been associated with the coronavirus? Do you see sort of a clampdown on rare species and things like that? Is that going to be a theme?
I didn't follow the question. It's about the wild animals?
That's correct, yes, about the wild animal markets.
Yeah, that's banned now, officially, legally banned. It's not regulated, it's just banned. The Congress passed a law, I think in the early March, specifically on this kind of animal market. It's really now banned forever.
Well, we've got a few questions returning more to core economics. So I've got a viewer here in Paris, Carl Pate. So far, he's enjoying this a lot, but he was wondering if you could give any idea of the measured impact, say in 2022 to 2024, about Chinese export manufacturing to the USA and the EU. How much repatriation of manufacturing are you expecting, or are you expecting continued export growth in manufacturing?
Repatriated means back to
our countries. So
export growth from China.
Instead of having it done in China, we would bring it back and do it in the West. Do you expect a lot of that, or because you talked about the +1, which I thought was a very interesting point. What are your thoughts?
I do not see big deal. I mean, do not see the huge repatriation. The people will compare the cost, compare the conditions, compare the infrastructures, compare to the new infrastructures like internet, like 5G, and also the clusters of the business. And labor cost, not the labor cost. Think about the total human cost. China now produce 4 million to 5 million engineers every year. So that's where the industry would like to stay, like to hire. It's hard to think about, you go back to the country where the labor cost too high and the other costs is too high. Of course, the technology is there, but I would say people still compare all this kind of things. So from that point of view, I would say there's going to be some repatriation, and people need diversification. People need to have this so-called safety, security for the supply chain. But I would say that's a kind of the marginal adjustment. It's not a total wave.
Now, Professor Fan, we work closely together with China Development Institute, CDI, on analyzing financial centers, us internationally and you very much so in China. I've got a few questions here, and kind of two parts really. Martin Watkins is very interested in any thoughts you have on how international financial markets will change, their supply chains, in fact, Do you have any thoughts on London, for example, looking abroad? And we have a second question from Henry Price, who's very interested in something you and I spoke about when we had our warm-up call. Do you think that FinTech is going to play a fairly large role in this? We've seen this whole online economy, and in many ways, I think China is way ahead of us, certainly in just having a base payment systems that work, and that gives you a platform to move forward, whereas we're still trying to get people onto payments. So those two areas, if you wouldn't mind, financial centers and the FinTech impact. And we've only got time for a few more questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this two questions are combined to one. We can combine it to one. It's the same thing. I believe that financial center in the future will have great role with the FinTech, or the FinTech will play the role, bigger roles in the financing, and the financial center must to include this in the business as much as possible. And this pandemic really promote the FinTech, I think. My 95 years old mother finally now learned how to use the WeChat payment, because everybody, you have to pay. In China, cash, the paper note, it's totally vanished. You got to, every payment is kind of digital. Also now the central bank are moving to issue so-called digital money.
Yeah.
And that's also
digital currency, yeah.
Right. Not only China, but I believe other central bank will also have this the digital things. So that's why I would argue, the financial sector in the future, this is the future for the financial sector, and for the business as well. And it shows the the good part of how to deal with the extra situation, deal with this abnormal situation. It's really not the new things, but it really give it big drive.
Well, I would love to have a webinar with you just on central bank digital currency. I've been impressed for many years with the clarity of analysis that the Chinese have had on this, on blockchain, on Bitcoin. There are comparable bits in the West. I happen to think the Bank of England is doing a very good analytical job, but you're actually taking action. But that's perhaps for another webinar. I'd like to close, if I could, on just two final questions. The first one is just a dip and a return. One of the areas, this is from Derek Ray Hill, one of the areas that's been most affected has clearly been aviation. And aviation has been a huge factor in trade models and a huge factor just as an industry in its own right, running at what, 2-3% perhaps of global GDP. So how do you think future models on international travel ought to be adjusted? Do you think the volume of international travel will ever return to the same level?
Yeah, well, again, I would say this is not the question for economists. This is a question for doctors. Until we have a vaccine, I don't think the international aviation will back to say half of normal. I really doubt it. So I don't know. I don't know how this play out. This still, it's not the beginning, but I would say it's not the end, not the beginning of the end. So it still, we need to see. But vaccine will be the key for the future.
Well, I'd like to end on a question. Economists, thought they were being really great when they said, "Is it a V-shaped, economic recovery?" Years ago on some recession, I forget. And then they came up with W, and now they're trying to use the entire alphabet. I've heard about U-shaped recoveries, I-shaped recoveries, or collapses, L-shaped. They go down and they stay flat. In a note this morning, which is interesting, the Bank of England suggests a 14% reduction in GDP this year, followed by a 15% projected growth in 2021. So they're kind of on a V-shaped, it'll almost come back to normal, leaving aside the fact that 14% down and 15% up still means you're behind. But
Yeah.
what do you project for the world, and what do you project for China?
Yeah. For China, I would say, well, if you take a growth rate, if you're not talking the income level, you're talking about the growth rate, we may have a V shape next year, because this is too low. And next year, the growth, as long as you have the growth, you have a very high growth, right? You can, now this year you have a 20% down, and next year you can have 10% up. But if you talk about the year-over-year growth, right? But if you say year over previous year, you still have 10% down next year. So that's you say that's a V shape, or you say that there's no character like this. You just go up and up. Yeah. So I don't think the world economy. This is Chinese economy. I don't think that the world economy will. Well, the growth rate may look better, but level will remain low for next couple of years. Well, China now start to have we have some growth. But think about this growth. A restaurant now you can only use 1/3 of the space. Of course, you have a growth compared to last month, but compared to the full capacity, you only have 1/3, right? So you have 2/3 down. So that kind of thing will remain for a while, and you still have a low level activity, and that I would argue for the whole world will be the same. Plus, those industries like aviation, like entertainment, and like the football, the German will start a football, but with no audience, right? So think about those kind of things are,
Don't talk about the football.
Yeah, it will take time. Yeah.
Professor Fan, I never thought about it, but I should hardly. I feel poor. I have only 26 letters, and taking on 10,000 Hansa characters, you can choose any recovery you like. I have no choice at all.
We need to look at the language debate or Mongol.
Yeah.
So then we can find the.
Yeah. Well, Professor Fan, all I can say is that this has been a truly delightful webinar to have. You are a wonderful guest. You've lit up the audience. Professor Fan, it has really been delightful, and I'd like to thank you a lot. And I'll give you, if I may, a virtual round of applause.
Thank all the audience. Thank all the audience too. Thank you.